Hello, everyone. I am Françoise Claire. I'm head of classical music for the Centre National de la Musique in Paris. I'm delighted to welcome you all today for this webinar dedicated on the London scene. London has always been a very active and energical scene in terms of music, classical, but now we are going to talk more about new initiative and the contemporary music scene. And Eric is going to lead the panel today, and we are very honored and delighted to have such a wonderful panel to discuss the topic. And thank you very much to all our guests for being with us today. That's going to be a very promising discussion on all the new models of the music culture in London. So thank you very much again to be with us, and over to you, Eric. And
Thanks.
Happy Christmas.
Yeah, Merry Christmas to you and all your colleagues at Centre National, starting with Victor, who is helping a lot on that panel. So thanks so much to the participants. We have a great honor to have you on board. Thanks to all our listeners. You have been very faithful since the beginning of the season. To say the truth, I think Françoise and I were dreaming of having that panel for a long time now. It was always our fondest wish to show to the European continentals how much the London scene is vibrant, and not only with major orchestras or major soloists and conductors, but also with a wonderful underground and not so underground scene with a lot of creation going on. So let's start maybe with introducing very, very shortly our guest. Let's start with Elaine Michener. Elaine is a vocalist, is a movement artist, is also a composer. Is that right, Elaine?
Yes, yeah.
So happy
latterly a composer.
Thank you. Thanks so much for taking some time on your very tight schedule for being with us. May I then introduce Hannah Barry from Bold Tendencies. Hannah will be introducing us to what is Bold Tendencies doing, how it was founded, for whom, and how it developed. Thanks so much for being with us today, Hannah. We have Andrew Burke, Managing Director of London Sinfonietta. So London Sinfonietta has been on the virgin age of recreating itself. And I'm sure Andrew will be introducing us to the new season framework, new tendencies, bold ones for sure too, of these most famous contemporary music ensemble. Thanks so much, Andrew.
It's good to be here. Thank you for inviting.
May I introduce you to David Taylor? So David Taylor is one of the most revered and how can I put it, raid into blogger in the classical music scene from North America up to Southeast Asia. He's based in London. We are a bit not only honored but also a bit frightful of having David with us, because he's also sharing with the utmost talent panels from time to time, and that would be a challenge also for us. It's so generous of you to be with us. Thanks, David.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for being here, and looking forward to chatting to you all as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Jack Bazalgette is with us too. So Jack has been co-founding a website plus different performing arts initiative around the site called Through the Noise. We have been happy to encounter this website from its inception, more or less. I'm sure Jack will tell us much more about business models, how it looks like, why it founded that website, and all the environment around. We are happy to have you on board, Jack.
Lovely to be here. Sounds like I've got lots to say.
Thanks. So maybe let's start. My first question is a very boring one for the ones who following up our web seminar for 2 years, more or less now. I would love to know a very simple thing. Why are you working, living, initiating things in London and not elsewhere in the world, where the world is so vast and big? So let's start with Elaine.
It's very easy. I was born in London. I'm a child of London, and it's my manor, and it's a hive of creativity, and the world can also exist in London. It's such a huge metropolis that anyone who comes here, they bring their culture, they bring their ideas, and it's welcomed, and it helps to change and keep the scene vibrant. And I guess the reason why I'm not doing it anywhere else, it's because recently we've not been able to go anywhere else. So, but whenever I have travelled, I take my London ways with me, which I think is always appreciated. Well, not always appreciated, but quite often is. And it's about an energy, and I like the very different types of people that live here and work here, and I draw on that energy. So yeah, that's why I'm doing what I do in London and continue to.
Awesome, thank you. Hannah, can you answer that direct question?
My answer is pretty similar to Elaine's, I'm afraid. I grew up on the edge of southeast London. I had the opportunity to start something here in Peckham, and that was 14 years ago, and I got addicted to working on it and never really left doing that, and don't intend to stop at this point. And I draw a great energy and daily learnings from the many people who surround the work that I get to do, and the people that are here on a daily basis, through to people who come in and out of the work. So that's a very basic answer to your question.
Marvelous one, thank you. Andrew, so London Sinfonietta has got London, it is very name, but we know of some orchestras or who may be called, I don't know, musiciens du Louvre or orchestres des Champs-Élysées, which don't have much to do anymore with Louvre or Champs-Élysées. So tell us why you are working and living in London.
Like Elaine and Hannah, a lot of it's to do with an accident of birth, if you like. I was born just outside London, but went to university in London. I think generally, the answer to your question, having had having travelled to a few major cultural cities with the ensemble in the last 14 years, what always surprises me about London when I come back is the depth of the activity. There is so much going on, and that allows for both tradition to be sustained, but also a lot of innovation. And the reason I enjoy London is because it almost expects innovation. And I feel certainly with the Sinfonietta, the best work we're doing is when we're breaking our tradition rather than just reinforcing it. And London allows you to do that, or sort of causes you and expects you to do it. And there's so many different initiatives that are going on, means that the sector has an instinct to reinvent itself, which I think is a healthy thing. Yeah, that's the big draw for me.
Wonderful, thank you. We come back to many of these concepts you have developed all three. David, so you belong to these kind of professionals who could be of anywhere, more or less. You are followed on dematerialized channels most of the time. And since I know you have a deep connection to the London scene and people, so why that?
Yes, so I have to confess to being an imposter to start off with. So I actually live in Yorkshire, which is 2 hours away from London. But in normal times, like most people who are outside of London, I live 2 hours away. So I justify my existence with how fast I can get back to London. And again, in normal times, I'd be in London on a weekly basis. For me, it's part of sort of, I wouldn't say a commute, but certainly a way of going, experiencing and meeting people. And going from what Andrew said about the depth of what goes on in London, there is nowhere around the world like it, and especially in the UK in terms of the variety of what is going on, the amount of what is going on, and also the number of people you can potentially meet, collaborate, exchange ideas with, whether you agree or disagree. I think that's a fantastic melting pot. So I think there is such depth in a way that I haven't discovered certainly elsewhere in the UK, but also to sort of second Andrew's thoughts, I haven't discovered it anywhere else in the world either. So for me, that's the thing, that its main strength, this incredible number of fascinating creative individuals and organizations collaborating, exchanging ideas, and hopefully making the world a more interesting cultural place.
Super, super. Jack, you're pretty much the same kind of work than like David. You're also most of the time speaking or communicating with other people through dematerialized devices. But what you're reporting upon is very much London, has a London taste, 100%, more or less, I would say. So why that?
I think what we do is very London-y in the sense that it's sort of a crazy combination of, like, I think quite urban culture and ultra sort of traditional classical music stuff. And I think it's totally possible in London because there's an audience that's willing to try new things, and I think just by nature of being so big, you're always going to have enough people who are into your weird niche, who are going to be able to turn up to concerts and that kind of thing. So I think it's always, I'm only guessing here, but I'd imagine it's easier to do different things that are quite niche in massive cities, because you find that there's so many people that you're going to have enough people to fill your concert halls or your rooms with people who love your little niche. My family are from Hackney area, so I know I'm sort of used to this kind of crazy combination of different music and culture and different and all kind of art and culture and people's different ways of living being lived out in public quite obviously. I think I'm quite used to kind of seeing cultures, seeing sort of the different cultures that have different heritages sort of on show in this street and in really public places. So I think that's quite a London thing. I mean, I'm sure that happens in lots of other places, and I think it's dangerous to be too sort of London-tastic, because it's not the only place where that happens. But I do think that there's this amazing thing in London where all these different communities offer so much, and often have these communities with different heritages have lived in London for such a long time that all the lines are a bit blurred, and we have this kind of amazing sort of melting pot of cultures and audiences and people. I think it's a wonderful place. I'm very pro London, but I think also the other thing is it's a great place to experiment with stuff and then to take elsewhere, and hopefully that in that way London sort of is a place where new things happen that can then go and travel the world. Yes, I don't know if that answers the question, but
I see. Oh, wonderful. So a second thing to confess, all of you, seen from a continental perspective, it's something like there's something like a London miracle, or English or British miracle, more or less. To summarize it in 3 different points. For artists to make a living in London, it seems, seen from Berlin, Brussels, Amsterdam, Cologne, maybe even Paris, quasi impossible. So first question mark is, where are the artists? How can you survive as an artist in London, either as an artist like Elaine or as a promoter, producer, curator, having to work on a daily basis with artists? The second thing is the public funding ecosystem. I don't need to tell you, all of you, it's a fifth, a third, or tenth, depending on what you were defending as a kind of music, from the one it is in Benelux or German-speaking countries, not to speak about France. Okay, so that's a second big dead angle for people staying that from the continent. Marvelous things are happening, exactly, or maybe even better, compositional adventures, commissions, interdisciplinarity, much more quite often than on the continent. But we don't know how the business models look like. It seems pretty hazardous for us, or let's say even miracles. And the third thing are audiences. Ticketing prices are not higher in London than they are in Munich or Vienna. By far not, depending, of course, what we were observing and which kind of performing arts we're talking about. But let's say on the average, it's not. And audiences, even if the city is, of course, 4 times bigger than Munich or Vienna, has so much competition around. There are so many things you can do in London from 7 or 7:30 p.m. that it seems also cause the miracles that audiences are popping up, and they do. I can't estimate. I've been living there for the last 3-4 years, despite COVID, and the audiences are there. So who can enlighten me on these points? Maybe not all of them, but I'm sure collectively all of them will be shared. I probably have forgotten some of them. So shall we start again with Elaine, with the artist's point of view?
Surviving as an artist in London is very difficult. It's very challenging, but it always has been, but even more so now. You have to be inventive, you have to be wily. You can't expect all of your income to come from working in one part of the country or in the UK. Or so if you are fortunate enough and have been in the game long enough, you will have built a reputation or built contacts outside, away from the UK. And from my own perspective, that's how I've managed to survive. But then it's taken a long time to do that. I can't rely on public funding to support my art. And for many years, I worked in a desk job. I worked part-time. People do other jobs to support their creativity. Not everyone. I don't come from a family that has a lot of money, so I wasn't expecting them to support me. I don't have a trust fund or anything like that. So I worked, and people work. They do other work that's not necessarily connected to what they do from a creative point of view. And then you just keep going, you keep performing, you keep doing what you do and trying to keep looking for those opportunities until an opportunity comes where you can transition from being a part-time, whatever, ex-worker to being a full-time creative artist. But it's not easy, and I think it's only going to get harder because of politically what's happening, and because being a creative artist isn't regarded, or creativity, being a musician, studying music at school, that isn't considered important by our current government. And in fact, before then as well, and under other regimes, shall I say. So therefore, it will increasingly be the realm of creativity will be the luxury of those who can afford it. But that's not necessarily the people who are the most inventive or most interesting. The interesting works rarely, in my opinion, come from those who have a lot of money. It's from those who've had the struggle and have something to say. But then we shall see how this plays out, because I think those of us who are managing to survive and to make work, we should also try to make those opportunities for others, to not pull the ladder up underneath us.
I understand. Hannah, would you also say maybe short description of Peckham is ecosystem, is environment. Not everyone knows maybe exactly how this archaeology, which is a very diverse one, looks like, and how you succeeded at for 14 years now, you said, at developing bold tendencies.
I mean, I think it's it's definitely a story of very intense struggle, and it started. But Bold Tendencies started with absolutely nothing, and in fact, I would also say, though, one of its virtues was starting with absolutely nothing. It didn't start with this sort of grand idea about what it was going to do or be. In fact, it didn't know whether it would be anything at all from one year to the other for quite a long time. And so, for a very long time, it was a sort of struggle to survive, let's say. But I always felt that there was something more interesting than just surviving, and that was, growing and progressing, and also creating, hopefully, some sort of loose system of opportunity that many different people could be involved with in lots of different ways. And I always imagined that kind of arc of opportunity, if it could exist over a longer period of time, could be relevant and useful and enjoyable for people, and enjoyment being as important as relevance and usefulness, could touch people at different times. And now, having done that for 14 years, I think sometimes we have been successful in engaging and involving people at different moments in their life. I mean, 14 years is actually quite a long time. So now we start to see, people who first came to Bold Tendencies with their parents, let's say when they were 10, 11, 12. Some of those kids now, I see them coming with their friends because they've just left university or are doing something else, or getting into music themselves, or have studied music, or so I'm not saying that Bold Tendencies is responsible for all of that, but I'm saying something about it is lodged in people's memories, and that, I think, is it's up to them how it lodges itself. But the important thing is that we do see that people do come back over time. But on the kind of more pragmatic side, it's really, really hard, and it has always been hard, and it continues to be hard. But that doesn't mean one shouldn't strive to do more and do it better, and probably do things you shouldn't really be doing, i.e. taking a very significant risk, not just in terms of finance, but in my case, and I feel a bit like the layperson in the room here with all of you, but music in particular, a number of years have been very involved with, I was just a person who really felt very intense when I heard a great piece of music. Not that I knew about it or I knew anything really about the context, or but I felt that was something somehow that intuitively I felt like the space we had and the way we like to do things, maybe we could contribute something to the richness that was already existing. And I mean, then the risk really is beyond the cost side of doing things, and in terms of scale, and there are very significant costs that just come because things have a certain scale to them, aside from all the other costs of just putting something on, and I'm not even talking about really sometimes doing it in the way that you might wish you could do it. Just the basics of it is costly. And on many occasions, I mean, in the recent years when we've had a board and, you know, robust governance and so on, you know, we've had to take some very significant risks, not just with the cost of it, but proving that it's possible by taking that risk, and also taking an intuitive risk on what one feels in terms of program and what's the right word for it, repertoire, what might work. So every time you take a risk, you learn from that in both positive and, I wouldn't say ever it's negative, you know, you learn in all kinds of ways. Doesn't mean you stop necessarily taking more risks and wider, longer risks as time goes by. But I suppose experience gives you the kind of robustness and resilience to take better risk.
I understand. Please, under your control, let me describe a little bit that kind of environment I was mentioning. So Peckham in this house is London. It is again under your control. There are three kind of populations there. A very mixed European continental with a lot of French people, for instance, and Italians, and also London people, Britons, very, very close to a very strong Nigerian and African community, all of this mixing wonderfully together in a way which is absolutely unthinkable on the continent, I must say. And you have performing concerts in a usual setting, to say the least. It's a marvelous art center combining cinema facilities, ateliers, workshops, open and restaurants. It's a former multi-story parking place, if I'm right. And so maybe a better description.
I just
please
be for clarity there.
Yeah,
I can say this very quickly. The Bold Tendencies exists. It's a not-for-profit. Exists in the top 4 floors of a former multi-story car park. And the very important thing to know about the building is that it's a kind of very substantial, brutal, concrete building. It is long. It is about 100 meters long. It is 33 meters wide, and it's 10 stories high. And our organization exists in the top 4 floors of that building. And because it's so high, it has very spectacular views out over the city. But the views aren't the sense that you're looking at from far away. You feel very close to the city on all sides. So that is where we are. And we started essentially as a sculpture exhibition project. And over the years, we've grown the organization into doing not just visual arts, but live events, let's say, as well, but with particular interest and focus on music, dance, and in recent years, opera, the big bad world of opera. And that's what we're up to. And we've also, because the place, though it's spectacular and beautiful, it's also very hostile at times. So we have had to put some infrastructure into the place to make it more hospitable. That being, in 2009, we commissioned a first piece of architecture, which was a cafe, which is called Frank's Cafe. But one key thing is that the top 4 floors are what we are responsible for. There are other developments now in the building, but those are separate to what we do. And there is a wonderful cinema in the former supermarket at the front.
Great. Thanks for this very important precisions. And Andrew, you are also not only in responsibility performers in town, and this for decades, but also having a direct link to 3, 4, 5 generations of composers in London, but not only, of course, throughout the world. So you're pretty much the center of that kind of miracles I was trying humbly to and modestly to describe. How can you give us some more infos and details on why these miracles are on everyday basis spectacularly solved?
I think, well, the Sinfonietta is relative to the world of new music, I suppose, is a relatively mature organization in the sense we've been around for 53 years. And across the history of the Sinfonietta, there's always been existential crises, it's not been a plain sail at all. But there has been quite a consistent and long-term relationship with our major public funder here in England, the Arts Council, which means that our particular context is benefits from that, but also is defined by it in lots of ways. So when we're working with established musicians and established concert halls and a level of delivery that is expected with the public funding, there's also a large amount of cost that goes with that. So you benefit from the funding, but you also have a higher cost base, I think, because of it. Having said that, when I look at my comparable organizations in Europe and the basic arts scene in different countries in Europe, at least I don't know whether my colleagues would agree, we're quite jealous, of the level of public funding that goes into the arts relative to the scale of the UK. And I only say that by comparison with how much funding goes into sister organizations in Europe, who can afford, therefore, to be full-time new music groups, because there's less questions asked, if you like, about the purpose of the art form. So that's the downside for us, that whatever scale in terms of public funding we operate at, there is a hand-to-mouth existence. There's a sense of having to be very innovative in what you do, where you find funding from, and how you make the total business package of what you're dealing with actually work. The advantage, I think, is that I think the UK generally has tended to lead in innovation. Certainly back in the 80s, when music education became a thing that went into schools, led by arts organizations, that practice, which predecessors of mine in Sinfonietta famously started by sending composers and players to work with children, that was a sort of initiated from the ground up, if you like, in response to situations in classrooms, but then became a sort of mandated thing from funders that you really should be doing this kind of thing. But that was ahead, I think, of a lot of practice that happened in the rest of the world in Europe. And some of that practice is still sort of catching up with where the UK is. And now it's worth saying, I think, that our Arts Council, which provides so many different opportunities for organizations and individual artists, is for the first time in a long time changing its strategy quite radically, more so than in past funding rounds. So there's now a direction towards ensuring that anybody who receives public funding is engaging more directly with communities and individuals, and making sure the art they make connects with people's lives and becomes relevant to it. So there'll be a sea change again in the next 2 to 3 years, I think, in the purpose for why arts are made. That won't stop art being made for its own sake, but it will change the landscape for all of us, whether we get regular funding or whether you go for project funding. It means the priorities of why you make the work will be considered differently. But those sort of seismic changes in our environment, I think generally have sort of kept the arts on its toes here, and people tend to find solutions and just keep on wanting to make things in new places or for new people, or to include a broader range of the population in what we do and make it more kind of contemporary in that sense. And there's a lot of change which I think the arts needs to go through here and will go through in the next few years as these processes accelerate. But again, I think as this conversation is partly to kind of compare notes between the UK and Europe, I think some of those particular circumstances might be mirrored in different countries, but I always find when I, again, travel to Europe particularly, that the conversation in the UK around these issues tends to be sort of slightly ahead, and but not necessarily because we're that more evolved. It's just out of necessity. We're sort of having to sort of not take so much for granted, really. And I don't think anybody with public funding is complacent about it. And if they are, then maybe that's going to change in the near future. And that sense of innovation and doing things differently is sort of necessary in a good sense. And anything to do with contemporary art, I think it's a very healthy thing to invent, reinvent, and take risks. And as I heard, we've all got sort of things we remember in terms of speeches and presentations and ideas that we've read or heard. And I remember once a filmmaker I was watching an interview with said, if you're not taking a risk such that what you're doing could actually fail, you're not actually doing anything at all. And I think there's that sense, certainly, which a lot of us on this call would share, that it's quite exciting to be doing stuff that might not work. And sometimes with established funding, there's a tendency not to take risk because you feel like you need to keep within the bounds of what's expected and to keep on the traditions you've got, when in fact, the challenge, I think, for us in the Sinfonietta specifically is to both honor that 53-year tradition, essence of it, and the music that we play from that period in the second half of the 20th century particularly, to honor that and to some extent keep playing it, because if we don't, there aren't many other orchestras, for instance, or ensembles that regularly program that music here. But at the same time, recognize we're over 20 years now into the 21st century, and that tradition needs, if you like, fostering and making and reinventing. So I suppose my general point is that with a group like ours of a certain scale, we certainly don't have the funding to do a sort of 60 concert season each year where we could happily keep together a tradition series, of the post-war period and make a lot of new work too. So you've got to make choices. And for us, the choice is very much to commission and make new work as much as possible, and then use the 20th century tradition that we've been involved in as a sort of context to that. But that's our particular case. And hard for us, even with us and the established position we've had, that the most vibrant way to be is to be prepared to look forward and reinvent rather than fall back and just sustain an established way of doing things.
Thanks. Also very wise. Well, we come back to Andrew to some of the things or projects. Recent one, like the one at Stone Nest, Robles Castle, and also the future one, which may exemplify pretty much and pretty well these words. Maybe Hannah, apropos Frank Lloyd Wright and opera and modern architecture, Frank Lloyd Wright had got a project for building an opera house in the 50s, which never came into reality, and it was in Baghdad, Iraq. So a pity we never could do that. David, having this word contemporary changing meaning, as Andrew was explaining us, in the Arts Council's mind, but also in broader sense in the communities and people's mind, is, if I understood you rightly in your blog for a couple of months and years, is what you were also insisting or stressing or underlining, like how can you as a blogger hint at people throughout the world who are engaging or committed at having this classical music world defining itself in a different way. So you have picked up a lot of people, but let's say, how would you define their common philosophy? How these energies, these commitments, this resilience Elaine was testimonying, what is behind all of this London spirit, Londony spirit. I heard from Jack this new word I will now introduce into my very poor vocabulary in English. What are the main, I don't know, philosophical, it's a big word, concepts behind it, which bring all these people, all of you here, plus many others, to go in the same direction and having that every morning, that energy to make it?
It's a very good question, and quite nicely, both Elaine and Andrew have actually touched on points that are my answer. Partly with Andrew using my most one of my favourite words at the moment for this, which is necessity. And I think for us, that's a huge driving force as to what we do. And as Elaine was speaking, I quickly checked up the figures so I didn't get them wrong, but the average salary in the UK is 31,000. The average salary for a UK musician is 23,000. So as a result, we are off the pace, especially with London being a very expensive city to live in. So finding other opportunities to work, whether, as Elaine mentioned, are in other sectors potentially. And I think that's a very good and informing experience as to what people can then bring to their creative output, but also for not just having one artistic job. And I think one thing that potentially sets London aside is this interdisciplinary multi-outputs philosophy that musicians have. So they have multiple income streams from working with a contemporary music ensemble or an education outfit or a professional's traditional symphony orchestra. And I think off the back of that, that really informs them from a creative point of view. They can take experiences from one to another. And that for me is actually a massive benefit in a way that if you were full-time salaried and comfortable in a different orchestra somewhere else, you wouldn't necessarily get on a day-to-day, weekly basis. It doesn't mean that struggle's not tough at times. I think that's been one of the things that comes through this in a similar way to people who live in New York. I always hear regularly that you really have to love the New York experience to want to live there on a day-to-day time basis. But I think that necessity is the big driving force. And one thing you mentioned in sort of your three questions to this as well was the funding model and differences between our contemporaries in Europe, where things are funded more. And I'm a big believer in necessity being the mother of invention. And for us, I think that's why it may come across that London is pushing boundaries in certain ways, because we have to find new ways of doing things. And the pandemic could be quite a good example of that. When for me in the UK and especially London, there was lots of digital output, there were risks taken, as Hannah was mentioning. There was lots of experimentation and trying to find ways of making things happen. Whereas as a mass generalization on the continent, there was less digital output, there was an easier ability to snowball, and as a result, there isn't that necessity there. And I think for me, that's potentially, provocatively would say that it's a cause for concern for artistic output in Europe, that if you are continuing funding arts organizations with no onus to change or experiment or do more, there's no inherent reason why they would ever want to. So what if you have done the same opera festival for the last 30, 50, 100 years? Why would you ever change that in a way? So I think for me, that necessity is a really exciting strength of the UK and particularly London for experimenting, trying new things, finding new business models that work. Some of them will fail, some of them will succeed. And through that, I think it reinforces that creative, positive energy, and that's ways of finding projects that you would never have dreamt of if you were fully funded. I'm aware it's easy for me to say that without the responsibility of running an organization and tearing my hair out when the end of the financial year comes about and there's nothing left in the bank. But for me, I think that's a massive positive step in a way.
Thanks so much. You will maybe in a couple of minutes tell us which initiatives after COVID, after the confinement times or lockdowns, you found the most interesting, and which ones you are envisioning they would be long-lasting. Jack, you are, through the noise, is pretty much a COVID child, more or less. So please tell us how you see these kind of three miraculous shortcuts I described applying to your business model, audiences, any kind of funding, public funding, or I don't know, tax credits for your patrons.
Sure.
Let us know a little bit more about all of this.
we have quite an unusual setup, and it's still early days, so I think you know, we'll find out whether it's a good one. I think just for context though, it's quite interesting, just briefly separately through the noise. I work as a freelance singer and musician the rest of the time, and I think it is quite interesting how many different things you have to do, and also the fact that in London it is completely taken as read that you'll communities as part of your life and your job, and it would be quite strange to not do that, even at quite a high level. I think not always, but I think that's kind of taken as read. I'm coming to you from a community centre in West London where I'm doing like a community choir, and it's just kind of like normal that you know, I'm sort of doing lots of different things to make it work. And so I think that kind of operating by necessity and doing lots of different things is a bit of a blessing, really. I think it is quite exciting, and feeling like everything needs to be done is always nice. Not that I suppose it's needing to do things to survive doesn't actually sound that glamorous, but anyway, so I think in that context it's interesting. And then to do with lockdown and stuff, I think, and coronavirus, Through the Noise would only really have been possible with that time that we had in lockdown. And I think there's a lot. The main thing to say about that is that I think to do with London, I think it really is it's really inspired by a lot of the things that are already happening in London, like Bold Tendencies, and like all of the huge movements that have happened in the past, like David was earlier, happening in the 80s. And I think it's a product of an amazing city that is constantly trying to find new things to make great culture work and still mean something. Our funding model in terms of that is very unusual. I haven't applied yet for any Arts Council funding. I wanted to try and see if it was possible to run it not commercially. We're a not-for-profit organisation, but make it sort of viable, which I think was a sort of, I think, quite a hot topic and an often discussed topic over lockdown is, you know, to what extent is this frivolous? To what extent does this need to be state funded? And it's totally not that I think that it shouldn't be state funded at all. But I wanted to sort of experiment and see whether it's possible to do something where it pays for itself, and whether there's a market for that, basically. And the evidence so far is that it is possible in some contexts. There are obviously limitations to what you can do, and we're doing small chamber music in small venues, so you know, it doesn't solve any of the problems of bigger things. But our funding model is that all of our concerts are crowdfunded, and the way that works is that we hire an artist, we contract the artist and find a venue that we think will work for them, and then we advertise the concert to our audience and say, if you want this to happen, then buy a ticket or back this concert and you'll be rewarded with a ticket. And they also get other perks like discounted tickets to other concerts around London that we've organised and that kind of thing. So the idea is that people back it so that they feel really part of it, and we're building a community of people that really want these kind of things to happen. And then when it reaches past a certain point where it's breaking even, then we announce that it's now confirmed and the concert goes ahead as normal. And the really important thing with that is that one, there's a really interesting thing about what actually happens on the concert day and the feeling and the atmosphere of the space. Everyone in the audience feels like they're part of it, and it feels like a community grown event where everyone there sort of standing there thinking, this wouldn't be possible without me. And I think there's something really magical about an audience where they aren't going to, it's a subtle difference, I'm sure, but just there's a difference between going to see something that's already happening and would happen whether you were there or not, and people having just a slight perception that they were part of making it possible. So that's sort of part of the thinking behind that. I think it's interesting, so far, we're about to do our fourth concert. We did our third one on Saturday night. And we're tapping into a slightly different market, the classical music market. We are pitching a bit like a kind of traveling club night, or a traveling kind of like a kind of distinctive event that moves around venues. And it's a different market, actually. And our audience is not really a classical audience mostly. I think it probably be maybe 30%, 40% a kind of normal classical audience maximum. And it's people who are interested in sort of alternative and interesting music, and who want to try new things. It's a kind of it's that kind of it's the kind of audience of people that just like trying stuff and are into going out and hearing new things and not really necessarily being sure exactly what they're going to get. There are limitations because I think that audience is probably not that big. I think, you know, I don't know how big we could take this and still be drawing in people like that. But it is it is interesting because I think that whole world is obviously like the kind of rock venue world is obviously not Arts Council funded, and it is you know, obviously commercial, and promoters and artists and venues run to make money in most cases, and also, I mean, not that they make loads of money, but I think it's rare that they have external funding as far as I know. So there's loads of limitations to it, but it's slightly, we're just seeing whether it's possible to do sort of music that's to do with classical music or slightly in that world in these venues, and it seems to kind of work. It's it's an interesting, slightly different take on it, but it's by no means better or anything like that. But it's just there's sort of there I think in a big city like London there's just place to experiment. I mean these concerts have been huge risks for us because the crowd-funded thing does mean that we've said that if something doesn't get backing, that we would then not do the concert, and that would be awful for our reputation with artists and the way we treat people. And you know, we're very careful to be upfront about that kind of thing. But you know, obviously that would be a nightmare, and our intention is that never ever happens, and we wouldn't advertise a concert that wouldn't go ahead. So yes, it's funded. It's quite unusual.
Thanks so much, Jack, for these explanations. If I understood it rightly, the noise nights you're describing are not only circumscribed to the one classical music concert. It includes a whole experience, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So the actual nights themselves are quite different. We've adapted basically classical style performing to fit into these kind of venues, and I have to say it's been an extreme uphill struggle to convince the venues and everyone involved in that non-classical world that all the little things that people who are in classical music take as read, everything from the way green rooms work to how artists need space, quiet, to every single thing that you could not possibly ever have thought of, is a struggle, and it's difficult to explain to people who are running venues that usually host big bands and stuff. Or a lot of these venues just host DJs all the time, so getting sound equipment and stuff is tricky. The nights that we run are called noise nights, and they have early in the evening 2 houses of the main classical artists. On Saturday it was Abel Slouchway, who is absolutely amazing, and he's an incredible cellist that combines his sort of South African heritage with his incredible skill playing Bach and Schumann and Debussy and that kind of thing, and he did 2 45-minute sets. We do 2 short sets of his music with 2 houses, so 150 come and see the first one, then they go 150 people come and see the second one, and if you come to the later set you can stay for a whole evening of music. And there was live music until 3 a.m. on Saturday night, and there was a live Afrobeat band that played for a couple of hours, and then there was a kind of reggae dub kind of group with a MC, and they played stuff, and all of the music had some connection to different South African cultures, and so the night has a kind of theme. But it's just the thing I wanted to do is reach the audience of people that wouldn't consider going to a classical music concert on a Friday or Saturday night because they think that that's the night they need to really sort of let loose and sort of have their kind of big night out. And I thought that they probably wouldn't go to the festival hall, even though they should. And I think that what I'm trying to do is get that audience to come to these concerts so that they would go to the festival hall further down the line because they've been convinced by a kind of crossover type experience. That's the vision. I'm not sure that'll ever, I mean, I really hope that'll happen, but we'll see what happens. Does that make sense? There's a lot of rambling.
Completely. Okay, and not only going to Royal Festival Hall, but after having been successful at co-producing the show through crowdfunding, because what you're doing is pretty much giving people power to co-produce. They may even go to one of Andrew's London Sinfonieta's next project, in which people will be participating to Kathy Milliken's work. So Andrew, this season, if I'm rightly informed, the London Sinfonietta has been or is experiencing a lot of different forms, a lot of different venues. Which are the highlights of this season?
I think really what we're gaining more confidence in doing is recognizing that there's an exciting place to be in curating the world that we inhabit. For me, it's sorry, I'll stop that again. We have had a strong tradition in the past of engaging people in new music, having started in the schools program in the 80s. And since then, I think there's been a general move towards public participation in the arts. But that's always seemed a little bit different from the high art, mainstream, venue-based quality or perceived quality concert, you know, where big new commissions by world-renowned composers are presented. And they've seemed a bit sort of like very important two sides of organizations' work, the worthy community engagement stuff and the high art stuff. But I think there's now a possibility which suits me very well because of my professional past, to bring those two things together. So I spent a long time in my past working in the education departments of orchestras and venues. And always my work was seen to be like worthy, but kind of literally the offices were down the corridor. You know, it's great that work's happening, but and yet we're still going to keep on playing these mainstream concerts on the stage for the audience that buy subscription tickets and want to hear their classical repertoire played again and again and again and again. And yes, I kind of know from my experience in that previous life that there's a very unique and special energy that comes when you have public participants taking part, which creates a different kind of experience, which is just as valid and moving and powerful. So I think we're becoming more sophisticated as a sector in finding a way to bring those two worlds together. Now that shows itself up in different ways. It's either bringing public participants onto the main stages, like the Queen Elizabeth Hall or the Festival Hall, and making work with artists and composers who know how to integrate the public into their art without it diminishing, if you like, or changing the nature of what they want to express through their composition. Or it means finding new places in which to be. So the art becomes very immediate to the audience, and they almost become participants in the ritual of the performance itself. So you referenced the Stone's Nest project. That wasn't our idea. It was a production with an organization called Theatre of Sound that came to us. Bartok had just come out of copyright. They decided therefore to leap on this and made a 6-player arrangement of Bluebeard's Castle, which sounds like an impossibility, usually because it feels a huge orchestra in an opera house. But they also took the theme of the opera and turned it on its head. So instead of Bluebeard being promoted as the sort of dysfunctional dictator type figure who's controlling the lives of his wives and sort of keeping his dark past locked in different rooms in his castle, they found a way of interpreting that story as a domestic scene with the wife sadly suffering from dementia, and the rooms are depicted as memories in a memory box that the husband, Bluebeard, brings out to remind of the different stages of their life. Well, it was such a clever reinterpretation of the way in which the piece was meant. It was performed in a tiny venue with only 150 people, with world-class singers and our musicians as well, which added a level of quality, I hope. And the experience for the audience was that they were right next to this and they felt part of it. And I think that one of the powers of these alternative venues, which have become such a part of both the alternative scene, if you like, but also the experience that more established organizations are now curating into, is that immediacy, that sense of connection with the public, either through the theme in which the story is made or the venue in which you're playing, or also in our case and other people's cases, making works of art which involve the public in their very creation. So recently we did a project just in July composed by Laura Bowler, which was about climate change, which is a very powerful concern of hers as an artist. And I asked her if she could write the piece in such a way that involved the public. So she asked the public to send in their own thoughts about climate change, which the text writer, the writer Cordelia Lynn, then curated into the narrative, into the text that was sung by Jessica Azodi. But then we worked with Katie Mitchell, and she came up with the idea of powering the production electricity generating hub in the real wheel. So we involved about 18 members of the general public sitting on bikes on stage, powering the music stand lights and the PA, and all the house lights, and all the power that would have been provided by the venue was disconnected for the duration of the performance. And it's a very, very powerful work that says everything about, I think, where we want to be, which is curating and making great work with and for the public, if you like, where their input is as serious with composers who begin to understand how to allow their work and their activity to be porous like that. And I think it's a really exciting future. So the range of projects we're doing this season are beginning to reflect that sort of mixed curatorial plan, if you like, where in different ways we want to connect the work we do to the lives and experiences of the audience who would experience that work. There'll be occasions when the straight concert to the passive audience sitting in a well-positioned and great acoustic concert hall are necessary and great. Some works speak really well in that setting, but there's lots of ways to do things differently. And it's that sort of constant rethink and reinvention, which I think is necessary, certainly for contemporary music organisation to, and possibly even arguably even more so for a classical organisation, is a necessary challenge, I think, to take in order to, be of today and not just become a museum-based organisation, really.
Right, great. And Jack's noise nights audiences can also attend next March 22, Katie Milliken's Night Shift project with the London Symph, with an audience participation to just to reflect on the bicycles energy power making. Katie Mitchell, a very short figure, the Opéra National de Paris, with his 2 concert halls in Palais Garnier and Bastille, needs as much electricity per year than 8,000 people village in France, just to give you kind of comparison. Elaine, if I may go back to these and again and again and again quotes by Andrew Pat, the traditional symphonic orchestra's activity on stage, you are pretty much someone who always wanted not to have that and again in your career and life. So your season, how does it look like? Which are the highlights?
Goodness. Well, it's been a strange year, but one of the things that I've been particularly excited about being involved in is being an associate artist at Wigmore Hall, and being given the opportunity for the next 5 years to program, curate concerts in which I will perform, and to pretty much do what I like. When I was approached, it was a bit of a shock, because I really did not consider myself to be the kind of vocalist that would grace the stage of the Wigmore Hall. But John Gilhooly was very clear in that I was exactly the kind of person that he wanted. So I just wanted to make sure that he knew what he was taking on, and that he wasn't going to get an ordinary concert from me. And Thankfully, that has happened. They have supported. I was one of my solo pieces, the then plus the now equals now time, which uses voice and electronics. It's a movement piece. I presented that during the opening season in September, and was able to transform the space of the hall into more of a theatre. And my next project for them is on the 8th of March next year, which is International Women's Day. And it's titled Women's Work, which references Rosa Luxemburg's idea, but also the Fluxus magazine, which takes an ironic point of view of women's work in terms of experimental music. And it was a Fluxus magazine that was produced in the mid-70s by Anya Lockwood and Alison Knowles. So I've brought together an ensemble of players to present quite a wide range of works by different kinds of women composers. But alongside that, I'm very interested in contextualizing what I do. So I've also invited two writers and thinkers to talk about post-colonial feminism and how that is experienced through performative work, but also feminism, post-feminism, and how that is executed through the work of women composers as well. I think it's really important to not just program work, but to think as someone who programs and performs work, to really share those ideas with an audience as well, and also give an audience opportunity to ask questions. Because quite often after performing, people say, oh, that was great, or that wasn't great, or they brush off, or, I'm really interested in the conversations that I had after a performance in the concerts that I'm presenting, and I'm able to do that at Wigmore. But it's not an entirely new thing. For me, performing at the Wigmore I treat that as seriously as I treat performing at Cafe Oto or Eclectic. For me, it's about the work. It's about conveying and communicating the ideas of the work to the best of my ability, and to treat an audience with respect. And Andrew, you mentioned about the passive audience. I don't think any audience can be allowed to be passive. The fact that they're there, they have to work. They have to work to listen, to engage with what's going on. And if they walk out, and I've had people walk out of my performances, I kind of like that, because that is a reaction and a response. What I hope is that they think about why they have responded in the way they have done. So if someone says they like it, I want them to think about why and say why they like it, and not just from a musicological perspective, but why is it resonates for them. And they don't even have to tell me. It's just about reflecting. So that's the kind of work that I'm trying to create, to encourage an audience to really engage on lots of levels, and to take that experience with them. Yes.
Wow,
yeah.
Amazing. Just to name but two of the composers you have been choosing for that show on March 8th have been very much supported by Andrew's London Sinfonietta, naming Hannah Kendall and Tensi David. So there is connection, and so 2 days later there is that work with Kathy Milliken on March 10. So a lot to do in London in a couple of months. Hannah, when next year will your season and festival start again, and with which kind of which artists, which projects? What are you mostly proud of and want to announce now?
We've for the last few years, we've tried to have a sort of subject that the programme has threaded itself through. So that in 2018, that began with ecology, and then in 19, it was fiction. Our subject matter for 2020 was supposed to was planned to be tragedy actually before the COVID unfolded. So we suspended that program. This year, the program looked at Arcadia, and next year's program will look at love in all its forms. And so we've been working on all the commissioning for the summer ahead. And it's quite a range of material in terms of the larger scale, going from what we call sort of large scale orchestral music. So there is a goal to do the Taranga Leela Messiaen, if we can possibly make it, through to the, what we sort of call in the round performances, but that simply means the audience ranged around rather than traditionally in the round. And we are very excited to again be working with the great choreographer Sharon Ayal, for whom love is the message, and amongst many other very, very exciting practitioners. I mean, it's such an honor really for us to be engaged in just the conversations about what people want to do in the place that we have. And that is really the starting point, rather than what do we want to do as such. I just see it that we are trying to create a form of infrastructure into which people can step and do what they've always wanted to do somehow. What was the other thing I was going to say? Yes, the other thing that we are doing for the first time next year, which is almost the last piece of the jigsaw in terms of space in the car park, is if you imagine a car park, because you've got to go up and down it, it has ramp, flat space. And on level 7, there is a ramp that we've always just walked up and never really done anything with it. But when I was thinking about raked space, and somehow I hadn't ever thought before, sometimes it takes many years to realize something that's right in front of you. The slope on level 7 is a natural raked space. So for the first time next year, we will use that space along with all the other spaces that I find it interesting in this world where, well, pre-COVID, people were spending hundreds of millions of dollars trying to achieve acoustic excellence and totally flexible space. I mean, in a way, the car park is the opposite of the first and the equal on the second, because it is completely flexible space, i.e. you get out the number of chairs you want and you move them around to create the configuration you need. But the slope will allow us to have a stage at the bottom of the slope, and then the audience of say 400 people ranged looking down. So that's very exciting. Being able for the first time to at will shut the sides of the car park, which we've never been able to do, that will allow us to be able to do, above 100 decibels should we wish to, which we've not been able to do, and to have a rake with a stage at the bottom of it. And for us, that kind of, again, in our sort of thinking about infrastructure, offers us another type of space that hopefully artists will be interested to think about what they would like to do there. So fingers crossed that will open, the slope stage will open for the first time next summer, and long may it last. Long may it love and last.
Yeah. Fingers crossed also you will be as successful with this love topic next year than you have been in 2020 with a tragedy one.
Yes.
Self-fulfilling prophecies, let's hope. David, when you are taking that 2 hours trip from Yorkshire to London, where are you planning, or who are you planning to see in the coming weeks and months in your future London trips?
Certainly. So I think For me, one of the things I'm most excited about by London is the flexibility and the fact that there are things that are almost spontaneous. So the short answer is I don't know. Although it's great to see the big symphony orchestras come back to their traditional seasons and they're still programming on a shorter basis. For me, the fact that small, flexible organizations can do things very quickly, they can put things on, and it may be a week or 2 weeks notice and I make a decision based on that, I think is something that I'm most excited by. But in terms of the organizations and people and artists that I'm excited by, as well as people who are in this room that I will have spoken very well about the projects I will probably go and see anyway. People like 12 Ensemble do some really fascinating things. Gesualdo 6 on the flip side, going for a choral group who have been fantastic during lockdown and keep pushing the boundaries. Becca Reed, who's an experimental violinist who's fantastic and I really love. And in essence, trying to identify those projects that are doing something different. Aurora Orchestra has all been fantastic. So with their recent projects as well in warehouses, and kind of people like Kaleidoscope Orchestra come down from the north into London as well. For me, what excites me the most is trying to see more about what the next generation is potentially doing. So the next thing I'm actually down for is working with students at the Royal Academy of Music. And one thing we didn't mention about one of London's strengths is its huge music education scene, particularly in that conservatoire level. I think it's so rare to get as many students and institutions in one city. So for me, I'm really fascinated to see what they're doing in terms of pushing boundaries. They're very experimental and being more aware of entrepreneurship in a way that other generations weren't necessarily were in the same way pre-pandemic, I think, coming through the conservatoire sector. So for me, they're the things that I think are really fascinating, and it's that sort of, the next generation seeing what they're wanting to experiment with and where that desire goes forward. So I'll be doing a lot around last minute decisions of finding out what's on a short-term basis. And also for me, I think a good strength of London is just taking a risk on things and things that you don't know. And I think it's the city that it's rare to find an equal for doing that with.
Thanks so much. We are running a little bit short on time. My fault. The very last chapter I wanted to open with you, so very shortly, and please raise your hand. The one among you who wants to answer is what should be, how can I put it, done in the next 1 to 5 years among public servants in the public policy in the country, Arts Council, different local governments or the national government, that energy and that commitment, that depth you were talking about in London, without putting too much at risk with people having necessity of crossing the red line where they stop being an artist anymore. I heard from the committee, in the House of Commons, this inquiry or survey on the artist remunerations, and 1 out of 3 British musicians, not only classical music, of course, also pop, etc., hip hop, were maybe thinking at leaving the business. So what would you do, David and Andrew? Plus.
Yes. So for me, one of the things that we haven't mentioned is this term Singapore on Thames, which is sort of replicating how Singapore's been successful for London, and that's normally in the commercial sector. And one of the big things that they're trying to replicate is this nimbleness in regulation, which I think is something that we desperately need to do in our music world in the UK. And that as London could be a global hub for reaching people in the digital world, our laws around digital music aren't up to scratch for this modern world. And you mentioned remuneration. I think a big one which may lead Andrew astray into his potential words is PRS and copyright law, and how that can potentially be a hindrance for helping ensembles create and champion and commission work in the digital space. So for me, I think having regulation that helps empower creatives to be successful in the digital space is a must for coming forward with that.
Andrew?
My comment really is based on current preoccupation. The Arts Council is such that it's spending, that people involved in organising things with public funding, whether it be from wherever and however they get it, the amount of time one is spending dealing with the process of that and the thinking around it is so intense that it's removing the ability to actually make the work and take the risks and enable artists and, you know, progress the sector for the public, for the audiences, for the communities we're trying to reach. So it may be a necessary growing pain or change in direction where once you do something new, you've got to invest in setting up the new conditions and processes around it. But I hope the public, you asked specifically about public funding strategy and policy, unless there's a lighter touch, once we've gone through this period of change, if you like, unless there's a lighter touch, I fear that the sector or anybody wanting to engage with public funding will be so overwhelmed by the paper filling and the monitoring and the feeding back and the organizing of it around the process of doing something, that it just gets in the way of the conversations, the dreaming, the thinking, the risk-taking, the wonderful work that can happen when you're in a space where people can come together and do that. So that's partly my preoccupation at the moment, but it may not be the concerns shared by everybody else. But I hope the Arts Council, hope we get through this phase and back to the preoccupation of enabling great composers, great musicians, great artists to make great work with and for the various communities that we passionately want to reach.
Thanks. Anna?
I totally agree with you. And I spent quite some weeks recently mulling over, not necessarily even mulling over, but thinking about, and we are not going to apply to become an MPO. We were asked recently about becoming an MPO. And I wish I could become an MPO, because we have a brilliant team, but and in order to do more, we need to uphold the positions of the team and ensure that the structure of the organisation is progressive. So young people coming in can grow through the organisation and progress their own personal ambitions. Those who aren't necessarily artists, but wish to support the making of art. And so we were looking seriously, and we were delighted to be asked, would we think about NPO? And having reflected on it with our board and so on, I said to the Arts Council that with regret, we are not going to be able to apply, not because we don't think that we can fulfill in an interesting and inventive, with some critical distance from the fulfillments you need to make to do it, but we don't have the capacity. And I think it's really important to say that we do not have the capacity to both continue to progress our own work and to progress the ambition of the programme and to progress the ambitions we have to support both, not just the new generation of artists, but artists at all moments in their careers. You know, the organisation in the car park, I don't want it just to be about early career. I think it should be about all moments in a career. And I think there is a value, as we proved this summer, the Philharmonia came to perform the Brahms 2 piano concertos in one evening. And I'd say that was a valuable thing in their career, you know, and they're a very established organisation. So I want us to be able to, with our little infrastructure, serve all moments, because progress happens at all times. But, you know, I'm also not going to hinder, you know, our own progress, because we don't have the capacity to fulfill the requirements on reporting, on even on data gathering, that, you know we hit certain data targets, but we don't have the means to process that data. And so in a way, there is as you were just saying, Andrew, you know, there is this moment that for sort of younger organizations without the resources internally, that you get into this vicious circle that you cannot, because you can't get the MPO funding, you can't therefore grow the team. as much as grow the program. You know, if you can't go the team, you can't fulfill the requirements. So we're going to have to look, we need to gain a new support for our core funding. Otherwise, we will not grow beyond where we are. We have reached the glass ceiling, you know. So we need to find another way. And in a way, this is our challenge. Like, this is where we really are. We going to actually, because we can't do MPO and we have to admit we can't do it, how are we going to get an alternative to MPO, and what does that look like to support core costs? Because teams of people need to be supported, and young people, you know, and I no longer classify myself as young, you know, younger people who want to be part of supporting artists and knowing what it's like, and working in the administrative side and the production side, also need to feel a sense of progress. So you have to have a sort of sense that your salary can increase, your responsibility can increase, your way you do your work, who you're responsible for, you know. So it's that we need to, you know, that's what I'm thinking, aside from entertaining myself about what the love program might look like. I'm thinking, what is the alternative for us to this NPO for core costs? Because we need to find it within the next year or so.
Yeah. Now, NPO being National Portfolio Organization, that means all the organizations which are subsidized by the Arts Council. That was really, really valuable and precious. Thank you so much, Hannah, for the. It's Christmas, one Christmas wish, Elaine and Jack, and the final words.
Oh, goodness. Health, happiness, love into 2022 and beyond.
Jack?
For all.
And add in more magical music.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you to all of us. It will be a very small Christmas gift, and it's already Christmas for a couple of years, but you must just know the Centre National de la Musique has always been very supportive of the London scene already for years before there was even a Centre National de la Musique. And as you may know, because some of you have been distinguished curators of that fund, the Diaphonic British French Fund is helping quite a lot with London projects at putting some of the taxpayers' money in France and sponsors and patrons throughout France, and of course in the UK too, into the London scene. It was such a great pleasure. That was my Christmas gift for me, to have you on board, all of you. Thanks very much. See you next year for all our listeners. Back to Paris in the studio at Centre National with François. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to all of you, and thank you so much, Eric, for leading such a distinguished panel. Indeed, the London scene is so vivid and so creative. It's always a big source of inspiration for us. I'm just adding a few words regarding the role of the Centre National de la Musique. Of course, we have this program, Diaphonic, which is really Franco-British, but also the Centre National de la Musique supports the French industry, the French music industry, to develop their projects abroad. And of course, the UK being our cousins, very dear cousins, we are delighted to discuss any projects with you. And if you feel like discussing possible partnerships on any projects, please contact us, and we would be happy to discuss that. So very happy Christmas to all of you, and see you soon again next year. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye, everyone.